Welcome to The World Below, The War in the Heavens, a podcast exploring the adventure, the intrigue and the magic of a land that lies beneath the celestial battle between gods and demons, a clash that has gone on since time immemorial. I'm your guide, your interlocutor and your host, Michael Pryor. Welcome everyone to episode 32 of the World Below, The War in the Heavens podcast. This one is all about King Dimon IV of Anarquist, also known as Dimon the Small. The overview. In a probably somewhat necessary recap, let's remember the final episode of Season 3, where we explored the reign of Dimon IV's father, Dimon III. It was a fairly uneventful reign, really, which only goes to show that not all monarchs can be mighty warriors, social revolutionaries, or even malevolent villains. The major highlight of Dimon III's remarkable reign was the tumbling mania, a strange disease that reached pandemic proportions across the world below the war in the heavens and saw an outbreak of helpless somersaulting everywhere. Dimon IV was born in the year 440. His sister Corin was born in 441, while his other siblings, Sendia and Ascot, were born in the years 444 and 446 respectively. With a peaceful and unexceptional father, Dimon the Younger's childhood verged on the idyllic. Small of stature, hence his nickname, he was a stocky and active child, skillful on horseback and a more than capable swordsman. He favoured outdoor pursuits, but he didn't neglect his studies and was competent in arithmetic, music and history. Dimon couldn't have been prepared for the somewhat premature death of his father when Dimon the Younger was only 15 years old. The transition was seamless, however, as Dimon the Elder had long prepared all his children for the succession, so much so that none of Dimon the Younger's siblings objected to his succeeding to the throne according to their father's plan. In return, King Dimon IV made sure that they had prominent parts in coronation ceremonies, with the crown passed from the chief hierarch of the temple to Ascot, then to Sendia, then to Corin, who placed the crown on Dimon's head. Furthermore, all three of Dimon's siblings attended his advisory council meetings throughout his reign, despite their tender years. 15-year-old Dimon applied himself to kingship diligently, but the burden of bureaucracy chafed him, and he preferred to take part in more active pursuits, sublimating this into spending much of his time with the army. He went on a number of inspection tours of border forts and emplacements, ordered massive troop manoeuvres and spent much time with armourers and tacticians, both practical and theoretical. In 461 he was riding with a small company of troops towards one of the border forts in the northwest of Anarquist when his party was surprised by a large raider band. The Anarquistian company was completely wiped out. Dimon was killed and his body never recovered. He was only 21 years old. Reign highlights. As you can imagine, a 6-year reign that encompasses one's late teens is unlikely to throw up many highlights. But Anarquist being Anarquist, remarkable events and people continue to crop up, often having little to do with the monarch at all. Chali Sinbesel. Chali Sinbesel never met Dimon IV, but Sinbesel arguably made a greater mark on the realm of Anarquist than the king, and almost certainly left a greater legacy. Chali Sinbesel was born on a farm in the northwest of Anarquist near the town of Yemen, close to the mighty Parshel River, in 441. From an early age she showed precocious artistic talent in drawing and in modelling the clay she found on the banks of the river. Her parents, recognising this, sent her to study with the eccentric hermit Androcles Boron, who lived only a few miles away. He was a formidable recluse given to titanic rages, and after it was rumoured he killed a coachman in an argument over a fare, he isolated himself, afraid of his own temper. Boron was a capable artist, having been trained at the Omnamble School in the realm of Perrin. Somewhat of a journeyman, his surviving works show him to be competent technically, if a little uninspired artistically. Boron turned Chally away, but she dawdled outside his ramshackle hut, drawing in the red dirt with a stick. Boron peered at what she was doing, only to be astounded at the likeness of him that the 10-year-old had drawn with a few deft flicks of her stick. He immediately took her back to her parents and arranged term, whereupon he would teach her technique until she needed him no more. This took 10 years, whereupon Chally, with Boron's encouragement and a letter of introduction in her satchel, farewelled her parents and took herself to Anarquist, the capital. Her stated aim was inspiration, for she had heard that Anarquist had long attracted artists of all kinds, while rich nobles and merchants were said to offer patronage and encourage talent. Her time in Anarquist isn't well documented, but two exquisite paintings of hers survive, The Wheelwright and The Fishmonger. Her ability to capture everyday life, but to lend it a numinous quality without overlooking mundane details of dress, food, surroundings, was overlooked at the time, but has been much praised since. A fellow artist, Semele Crassus, managed to paint Chally in her dingy studio, the only likeness we have of her. In this hasty work, Chally is shown as merry, hair hastily tied with a length of string, shaking a finger as if to say, "Don't you dare paint me." It is a much-loved work. In a remarkable 12-month period, Chally turned to sculpture, learning the rudiments in the workshop of Semele Crassus's brother, Milo, before engaging in her most famous and enduring work, thoughtfulness. It's not known where she obtained the marble or how she survived the unpaid months while she worked on this extraordinary piece. She had no patron that we know of, and she had ceased painting entirely while she concentrated on sculpture, and there went her only source of income. The story goes that she slept little and ate even less, driving herself to complete her masterwork. Thoughtfulness is the name later given to the piece, but it's not known if Chally ever titled it so. The youth sitting on a log, leaning against a tree trunk, is astonishingly real, with perfect musculature, posture, and hair, but this piece isn't just an exercise in documenting reality. The youth's slight frown, his distant gaze, his air of contemplation as he considers something either mundane or ineffable, or perhaps both, is famous for the way it entrances onlookers, some of whom have been known to study it for hours. It's been copied hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, and it's inspired works that reference it, sometimes jokingly, sometimes adoringly. Chally Sinbesel died not long after completing Thoughtfulness, perhaps suffering from the intensity of her creation and the neglect of physical matters. Thoughtfulness has become legendary in Anarquist and beyond. When Chally Sinbesel's body was discovered by concerned friends, slumped against the plinth of her masterwork, they were naturally distraught. But the more practical among them weren't too distraught to organise an auction in an effort to pay Chally's creditors. The major domo of the royal household, considering herself an aficionado of art, used a large portion of the household budget to buy the statue and found a place for it near the throne room. When the budget deficit was discovered, she was about to be sacked until the king saw the statue and he immediately approved the expenditure. Thoughtfulness has moved about Anarquist ever since among royal buildings and public institutions, but whenever it has been on public display, it's attracted large crowds, notable for the reluctance with which people are to leave contemplating the exquisite statue. It's now on display in the Anarquistian Museum. Thoughtfulness, an Anarquistian icon. Raiders. Raiders from the northwest of Anarquist became more and more of a problem during Dimon IV's reign. At first it was thought that the raider problem was exaggerated by the leaders of the Anarquistian military to justify importuning for more money. But when the town of Zenta in the west of Anaquist was wiped out in a sudden attack in 456, the naysayers were shouted down. With King Dimon's encouragement, the Anaquistian army embarked upon a program of, essentially, mobilisation and upgrading. Border forts were repaired and modernised, armories worked night and day, more patrols and border parties were authorised, a recruitment campaign was well funded and undertaken, and some reorganisation of military command structures took place. A number of towns in the north and northwest built defensive walls, some of which survive to the modern day. Dimon was more than happy to foster this, and he involved himself in the process as much as he could, conducting half-yearly parades through the streets of the capital to foster pride in the military. Raiders were soundly defeated in the Battle of Oreth, 556, the Battle of Match, 557, and the Battle of Hanspar, 557. But despite the celebrations, in reality this did little to stop the incursions. Instead, the raiders avoided large-scale confrontations with the Anaquistian military and opted for smaller raiding parties that reaved the far-off north and northwest of Anaquist, making lightning strikes and then dissolving back into the wilderness before any sizable Anaquistian force could arrive. It was encountering one of these raids that Dimon met his death. The Minto Scandal. A minor case of corruption that became a major disgrace with implications far beyond its shady origins, the Minto Scandal involved two distant cousins of Dimon IV, Paulino and Etta Anaquist. What began as a case of low-level corruption became, when exposed, something considerably more sinister. Paulino and Etta Anaquist, brother and sister, were in their early 20s when Dimon IV came to the throne. They were raised on their family estate to the east of the capital, a day's ride away, but in their late teens they were drawn to the bright lights and opportunities of the capital. It's unclear when they hit on the scheme that brought them to the notice of authorities, but it was certainly underway by 558. The scheme was a minor variation of the age-old practice of taking bribes to arrange a private audience with royalty. Since monarchies began, people of influence and power close to the monarch sometimes went about offering a private audience with their ruler at a price. Usually discreet and never condoned, it was never far from the royal court, often with the monarch left puzzled at why such and such a person was granted such a prized meaning at all, and the grandee who arranged the private audience left counting their gold. If discovered, of course, those responsible were shamed and possibly banished, but Paulino and Etta were convinced that they were too clever and too well connected ever to fall foul of such a fate. The somewhat clever twist that Paulino and Etta Anaquist hit upon was to frequent the royal court, as members of the Anaquist family were entitled to do, no matter how distantly related they were to the monarch, and market private audiences to the hopeful, take their cash and never fulfil their promise of a meeting with the monarch, instead reporting their gullible dupe for attempted bribery. So far so clumsy, but a year and a half of accumulating gains that weren't just ill-gotten, they were ill-spent. They essentially brought themselves to the attention of palace authorities by spending lavishly on clothing, jewellery, and for a time being the leading proponents of the belled footwear fad, and essentially overdoing it through lack of both taste and discretion, cladding themselves in bells up to their knees. It was this buffoonish display that led to their only known interaction with the king, when, during a throne room general audience, he asked his chamberlain who was making all that infernal jingling racket. It was Paulino Anaquist who made the mistake of not recognising Ascot Anaquist, the king's younger brother, and offered to arrange a private audience for him. The quick-witted Ascot agreed, but claimed he needed time to find the gold demanded by Paulino. He immediately went to the chamberlain, who informed the king, and soon Paulino was hurried to the roofless tower, one of the oldest parts of the royal stronghold, rarely used in these days, and then mostly as a prison. It didn't take much questioning before Paulino confessed and implicated his sister Etta. But without much prompting, he spilled much more than that. You see, they needed their clumsy scheme in order to pay off huge debts they had to a notorious blackroot peddler, an explainer. The scourge of blackroot essentially disappeared in the 900s with the presumed extinction of the blackroot plant, but for some hundreds of years blackroot was a euphoric preparation made from the blackroot plant that grew in arid areas in the interior of the continent. Highly addictive and highly sought after, it naturally became hot property for criminals. Legitimate traders selling this preparation, apothecaries and such who prepared and used it very carefully and very sparingly, often for palliative reasons with the incurably ill, were driven out of business by threats, extortion and violence, with the result that eventually the only sources for blackroot across the world below the war in the heavens were criminal gangs. Blackroot was a hardy trailing plant, the root of which needed to be harvested, sun-dried and then reduced to a powder that was mixed with water into a potable concoction, if bitter. When imbibed, it created a general lassitude and a mild euphoria, but also a strange feeling of confidence and competence. Those who became addicted were often noted as braggarts and attempting matters far beyond their capabilities. Physically, prolonged addiction brought about heart and liver issues, fatal in the long run. Blackroot was a scourge in Anaquest long before Dimon IV's reign, but the confessions of Paulino and Etta began an investigation that revealed a long chain of corruption, vice and brutality brought the blackroot to Anaquest and other centres of civilization, but where it began shocked the investigators. Almost the entirety of blackroot harvesting in the interior of the continent was under the control of the same raiders who were causing such havoc in the far north and west of Anaquest. Ruthless in the extreme, these raiders were using hordes of slaves to harvest the blackroot, a gruelling process in the heat of the interior. Thousands were involved and many died, which necessitated more raids to obtain more slaves to replace the unfortunate. Thus the minor scandal became a major scandal. At his council of advisers, Dimon IV insisted that the blackroot trade be brought to an end. Several well-known members of noble families were implicated, their property seized and their names disgraced. More money was poured into the military and more patrols were established at the borders. Pamphlet campaigns were instituted, proclaiming the evils of blackroot and, for a while, the scourge abated. But it was only in the 900s that it truly ended, when the overexploitation of the blackroot plant wiped it out entirely. Paulino and Etta Anaquest were banished and ended up in a southeasterly part of Jalox in a fishing community, doing their best to make a living as net menders, until Paulino drowned while trying to claim Flotsam, whereupon Etta began writing a memoir that remained unfinished at her death. Fashion. On a lighter note, and to show that people in the far past of the world below the war in the heavens have the same sort of foibles as people today, it was during Dimon's reign that a fad for extravagant footwear of a certain sort flowered, peaked, and then died away, with people a few years later denying all knowledge of ever having worn such outlandish things. Naturally, only those who were reasonably well off had the wherewithal to indulge in such impractical fashion, and I like to think that titanic amounts of eye-rolling went on from the workers and less well off in Anaquest. What I'm talking about, and already mentioned, is shoes and boots decorated with bells. Scrolls and some stone engravings show the advent of this fashion in 556, with well-to-do folks suddenly appearing with one or two small bells on their instep, either stitched in or woven through laces. As is often the way with such things, this began a fashion arms race, and very quickly a pair of bells wasn't going to cut it among Anaquestian trendsetters. 3, 4, 5, 6 bells were sported with gusto, but some went the other way, and instead of multiple bells, they had a single bell, but a larger, finer bell, with a more arresting tone, so that when the wearer promenaded down Anaquestian streets, their presence was announced in front of them. Shortly, both men and women vied to have the most modern, most arresting, most reverberating footwear. The fashion for belled footwear had effects on other garments. Trousers, leggings, skirts and dresses were cut away so that the wearer's bells could be seen, admired and could ring free. Then, of course, the cutaways received attention and the edges began to be scalloped or decorated with gold and silver thread or bric-a-brac of dizzyingly patterned kinds. During this fashion mania, I imagine that some of the more upper-class streets of Anaquist began to be almost unbearable, with the jingle, jingle, jingle of the modish trying to outdo the stylish, and the clang, clang, clang of the trendsetters trying to one-up the à la mode crowd. Bells, 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 echoing up and down the town. A small fashion museum in Anaquist today has some of the belled footwear from this period. The early examples look positively demure when compared to those from the height of the craze. They simply had a bell or two adorning the instep. In the last phase, though, at the height of the craze, it's hard to see the footwear at all, so smothered are they with bells of all sorts, silver, gold, brass, or maybe enamelled in many colours. A very, very few even went so far as to have bells made out of heavenly scales. But this move was quickly curtailed when Hasso Flen, husband of the great banker Melpomene Flen, had his left foot blown off due to the unfortunate and poorly thought out combination of scales in one of these bells. Eventually, a number of Anaquistians were badly injured when stepping off gutters, and more nearly came to grief after stumbling, falling, and then having difficulty getting up again, while being laughed at by the more sensible and less fashion-conscious passerby. And then it was as if the entire population collectively looked at each other and said, "This is incredibly stupid. Let's stop it and buy some sensible shoes instead." The belled footwear craze ended almost overnight, spawning the Anaquistian saying, "As much use as bells on a boat." The Scribbler. The Scribbler was a famous or infamous figure for 2 or 3 years of Dimon IV's reign, notorious enough to be remembered. He was essentially a graffito exponent, and his identity remained unknown even after his activity ceased in 558. He was famous for daubing scurrilous rhymes on walls, bridges, and public buildings. He wasn't afraid of skewering the high and mighty with his couplets, but the more lowly didn't escape his barbs either. One famous example was still readable in the 1400s, on the underside of a culvert just outside the walls of the stronghold, in which the scribbler excoriated Hanno the butcher for the execrable quality of his sausages. We have no record as to the fate of Hanno the butcher, but the culvert was irrevocably damaged in the citywide floods of early 1501. Many guesses were made as to the identity of the scribbler, ranging from members of the royal family — Ascot was widely held to be a possible candidate — to literary figures like Einar Liege, author of Bald and Ribald, a series of Romana Clef profiles of prominent Anaquistians. It was never seriously considered, as she eschewed poetry, especially doggerel, as rhyming nonsense, and many others were considered as possibly hiding behind the scribbler moniker. The scribbler became a favourite of Anaquistians, both high and low, and they had a number of imitators, one of whom dubbed themselves Little Scribbler, because they simply daubed 2-word efforts about the city, something like "Hanno, bad," and having the cheek to sign such an effort, something the original scribbler never did. Much, much later, a highly romanticised version of the scribbler was a hero of a series of 17th century Anaquistian novels, where they not only championed the downtrodden through their verse, but also freed the wrongly imprisoned, bested dozens of villains with dashing swordplay, and won the swooning hearts of a series of good-looking and well-dressed Anaquistians. Personal life. We have no portraits or busts of Dimon IV, but coins from his reign show him to be a good-looking youth in the Anaquistian family manner. As for the fashion of the time, he is clean-shaven, but under his crown his hair is short at the back and sides, but long at the rear, in something we might, if we view it sidelong, point out that looks suspiciously like a mullet. As evidenced by his dealings with his siblings, he was fair-minded and even-handed, not afraid to seek and listen to counsel. Dromka, in his magisterial 17th century text, The Monarchs of Anaquist, considered that he would have become a memorable Anaquistian monarch if not for his premature death. Few personal anecdotes about the young man survive, and even fewer that aren't related to his interest in and his involvement in the military. His sister Corin, who succeeded him, is said to have fondly remembered his weakness for playing games of dice, whether wagering or not. He is one of the rare Anaquistian monarchs who didn't leave a cylinder in the Library of Souls, and there is no record of him taking part in the ceremony of imparting. In the 15th century, a short-lived cult sprang up, worshipping Dimon IV as God's favoured. Cultists claim miracles came from worshipping the boy warrior king, and several reported visions of him fighting alongside the gods in the heavenly struggle against the demons. A cairn was erected on the supposed site of his death near the Parshell River, and it became a shrine with pilgrims coming from afar before the cult was suppressed by the temple in 1613. The succession. Because Dimon died as he did at such an early age, the succession was thrown into confusion. The Compact of Eucantha had been followed ever since its inception by the revered founder of the dynasty, even in the most turbulent of years. But how to resolve a situation when a monarch dies so unexpectedly, so young, and with no offspring, and without naming an heir? This was a recipe for dissent at best, and civil war at worst. Oh, war is the common cry. Pick up your swords and fly. Fortunately, Dimon IV's siblings were less ruthless than most members of most Anaquistian royal families. Upon hearing the news, Corin, Sendir and Ascot immediately locked themselves in the royal apartments with their mother's sister, Farahild. Farahild Jefba was a remarkable figure in this uncertain time. She lived in the royal apartments but spent much of her time observing the heavens any way she could. In early adulthood, becoming a renowned scholar on both movements in the heavenly battle overhead, also heavenfalls, and the celestial bodies that could occasionally be seen beyond the battle, the bodies we know as stars. With Farahild's good counsel, Corin, Sendir and Ascot emerged after a week with the succession neatly organised. Corin would succeed to the throne with the endorsement and support of her brother and sister. Aged only 19, she did. Final words. Dimon IV, young and brave, steadfast with his sibling. And that's all for Season 4, Episode 2, Dimon IV of Anaquist. Next, Corin I, the Battle Queen. This has been The World Below, The War in the Heavens, a podcast exploring the history, culture and esoterica of the world below, a continent of magic and mystery with inhabitants who keep one eye on the sky at all times. I've been your host, Michael Pryor. If you'd like to find out more about me and my books, pop over to www.michaelpryor.com.au. Farewell.